I'm a rare bird because I came into the planning field in 1954 when I was faced with the decision as to what I'm going to do with the rest of my life, and I got my undergraduate degree. Someone told me that there was this field of planning. He was an advisor of mine. And I said, what's that about? And he said, well, read a book by Lewis Mumford, The City in History. I don't know much about it myself, he said, but you get an idea. So I read The City in History that summer, and I said, this encompasses so much, it certainly would encompass some of my interests, and I ended up going to the University of Pennsylvania for a master's degree in planning. And from there, I was actually in the practice of planning for a number of years. So I'm a later entry into the academic world. I do not have a Ph.D., which at that time was rare because there weren't that many programs, and I didn't particularly want a Ph.D. So I worked in Philadelphia in redevelopment and renewal for a while, and came out to the Midwest, and I've spent the rest of my career living in Champaign-Urbana first, then Chicago, where I worked at ASCO for about 10 years during the 60s. And then from there, I kept on going north, and I ended up in Madison, Wisconsin, when I decided that I wanted to stay in planning, but to now move into a different venue for expressing myself, and that was the academic world.
About 3/4 of the way through architecture school, I met a man named David Crane, who was the dean of architecture at Rice University at that time. And he was very big on urban design and urbanism. And so what happened to me was that I really caught the urban bug very early. And Dave Crane was a great mentor, and so he was really influential in what I thought about what was important at the time. But I think that it was, at that time, there were a number of us who became very interested in it, but there was still a lot of resistance to the idea of urbanism or urban planning within the architecture program. And architects today still have some resistance.
May I ask approximately when you bought this book?
Let's just say it was in the 70s.
Yeah. My relationship to planning only goes back 42 years.
Because you're so young, that's right.
Because I was so young and a late bloomer, but really it goes back to when I was a college sophomore in 1966, and I really wasn't happy with my majors. I had bounced between math, and then I was in physics and philosophy, and eventually ended up in sociology. And I thought I wanted to be a math teacher, but then I didn't. And what I really liked was sort of the social science aspects. That's why I ended up in sociology. But I also liked the kind of mechanical things. That's why I started out as a math major in physics. And somebody said, you know, there's a course in city planning taught by Ted Bacon, who was my first mentor in planning, wonderful man.
Ted or Ed?
Ted Bacon, not Ed Bacon. Ted Bacon.
And where was this?
At Theodore Bacon at the University of Massachusetts, where I was an undergraduate. And so somebody said there's this course in city planning that you might like that course as an elective. So I went over and took it. It was perfect because I got to do the sort of social science part of it, and I got to do the very mechanical part of it. And there was a lot of mechanics, maybe even more mechanics to the planning process than there is today. So that's how I started into it. Got sucked up by Vietnam, couldn't get out of it. Ended up getting a commission in the Navy, went to Vietnam, did 3 tours as an officer in a job where our orders were not to get shot, so it wasn't that traumatic, but it was disruptive. And came back, taught ROTC at the University of North Carolina, got my master's there, saw Dave Gottschalk last night at the reception, and had Jack Parker as the chairman of the program, and Ed Kaiser was one of my teachers, and David Gottschalk, I wrote my first article with him, and it was a wonderful thing as a young graduate student to be invited by a professor to co-author a book review.
What was your?
It was a book review. It was the first little piece I did. I've done, I don't know, I sort of lost count, but I'd say about 200 articles and 4 books since, and it was a wonderful start to have that. And after I finished my master's degree and finished my tour of duty at the University of North Carolina, left active duty, went to Yale Law School, realizing that if I really wanted to be an effective planner, I ought to have the skills of a lawyer. So never intended to go to law school, never intended to practice law when I went to law school. And then while I was in law school, I worked for a couple of law firms and said, this is pretty good. I can do a lot of what a planner does, but do it in the context of a law firm.
When I first got into planning, and my first real job was, while I was finishing the Ph.D., was working for the Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority, and it was literally the heyday of urban renewal, although, again, it was right at that point where the urban renewal program was being cut off. Nixon decided it was actually too expensive because now they were starting to pay good relocation benefits, paying real prices for property, and suddenly urban renewal was equitable and therefore too expensive. It was okay when it was inequitable or unequitable, but it was not okay when it was equitable. But what's interesting is that when I got into my approach to planning through the Housing Authority was seeing a beginning of institutional switch towards a true participatory planning process, because they had given voice to it, but they were really being confronted with residents in neighborhoods that were really deteriorated in Richmond, but where the people said, I still like my neighborhood, literally laying down in front of bulldozers as we at the Housing Authority, again, a group of us were as critical as you could be and hold on to your job at the same time. And of course, we all scattered and went into academia so that we could really be critical and not lose our job. But it was really a transition period. And I became very interested in neighborhood planning, even though, again, I went into academia, but my research tended to focus on that and also looking historically at how planning had changed.